Thanks, man.
Hey.
That was nice. Wow. Well, that was probably the warmest introduction I've ever given. I'm really glad that I didn't do the one slide I was going to do picking on Mark a little bit. Now I would have felt awful after that whole thing. No, that's great. No, and I've loved the DJ thing, by the way. That's like such a fantastic touch. And I've been, exactly right. It's been awesome. And when Jonathan was up there and he was saying that he felt like he needed to say something cool, in the thing, it got me thinking. I'm like, I'm just going to, throughout the talk, just drop all of these one-liners that would sound really cool with a nice beat behind them. And then I remembered that I'm from the middle of Wisconsin and we listen to country music and I don't know anything about this stuff, like the beats, and we just sing about like trucks and whatnot, and it's just not going to fit. So I'm not even going to try, sadly. I wanted to start with a cartoon, though, because we've got this big stage. Why not do it, right?
Hurry up, hurry up!
Make it a little louder.
Here, let's see that thing. Fricasseeing duck. Well, I guess I'm the goat. What? You're a dirty dog. And you are a dirty skunk. I'm a dirty skunk? I'm a dirty skunk? Brother, am I a pigeon?
I love cartoons. I do. I love it. This is a safe place to say that, right? As a grown man, I can admit this to you guys. I love cartoons. And I have my dad to blame for that. My dad was really into comedy. He was really into cartoons. When we were kids, Saturday mornings weren't just for us kids. In fact, maybe they were more for my dad than anything else. He'd be sitting right next to us watching these and laughing probably harder than all of us were. And I'm the same way. Whenever my kids are watching cartoons, I try to find any excuse I have to sit next to them and watch the cartoons as well, and even little things meant for like preschoolers, and I'm still kind of giggling along. It's kind of embarrassing. But my wife has several times commented on this. She's commented on how much she admires my childlike enthusiasm and excitability. At least I think that's what she's saying when she says I can be childish. But I do. I love cartoons. And in particular, I love the Looney Tunes. And I love the Looney Tunes from what I consider the golden era, which is like the late 40s and the 50s. This was, I think, 1953. This was right in the middle of that. And they had this amazing crew working. They had Maurice Noble, was doing layout design. Maurice Noble, when you get into animation design and layout design, he is like one of the highly regarded figures there. Even late in life, when he was struck with glaucoma, he could barely see anything, he was still consulting with Pixar on movies like Monsters Incorporated and things like that, because he could still envision inside of his head what colors and what things might work there. Mel Blanc, of course, was the man of 1,000 voices. Porky Pig, Foghorn Leghorn, Daffy Duck, Bugs Bunny, Yosemite Sam, you name it. If they were in the Looney Tunes, it was Mel doing the voice, which is just incredible. And then Chuck Jones, of course, who is, in my opinion, the best director the Looney Tunes ever had. And if you really want to have a nerdy debate, we can discuss this later, like cartoon debate. And you're only allowed to say Tex Avery. That's the only other name that you're allowed to enter in there. But you had Chuck at the helm, and so you had this amazing team, and together they were busy perfecting and refining the Looney Tunes cartoons. You see, around this time, Disney was really driving animation, right? And Disney was all about pursuing the illusion of life. They wanted things to be realistic. They wanted you to forget that you were watching a cartoon. And at first, Looney Tunes tried to copy that as well, but then they started going down the opposite path. And they started to embrace all the slapstick and the nonsense and the silliness that animation actually allows. And that's not to say that the quality was any less because they weren't going for this real-life thing. In fact, the Looney Tunes cartoons they were producing were incredible. The timing was precise, the personalities were crisp, the voices were sharp. It was cartoon animation at its finest. This is What's Opera Doc, and it's commonly cited by critics as being one of the best short cartoons ever created. It's brilliant from everything from the timing to the background layouts and things like that. And it's kind of mind-blowing when you think about that, right? Not so much that the cartoon is critically acclaimed, but the fact that there are cartoon critics, that people get paid to do this. Like, I like web design, but I took a wrong career path at some point. That's what I should have been doing. I know, but these are great cartoons, and we don't think about all the work necessarily that goes into getting these on our screens. You see, before all the color and the funny and the animation, it actually starts with a bunch of sketches, as it does in many industries. At some cartoon shops, the writers would actually write out a full script. They'd write out all the dialogue and the camera movements, a lot like live film is done. But at Warner Brothers, they didn't do it that way. The writers, despite having no formal training for drawing or anything like that, they were required to explore the story in sketches at the very beginning. They were working in a visual medium, so they wanted to be immersed in that visual medium for the very beginning. So they started with what they called story sketches, and these were, they didn't look as good as the one you just saw. They were really kind of crummy, very loose sketches, and they were exploring the plot and exploring the camera movement and some of the dialogue, and just fleshing out, is there something we can do over 6 minutes that we can make out of this. And this step would take about 5 weeks or so, and by the end of it, they'd have about 150 of these things for a 6-minute cartoon. When they were pretty happy with that, they'd move on and start to flesh that out into a full-blown storyboard. The storyboard would consist of usually around 300 pieces, and they'd start to fill in the dialogue a lot more, as well as look at things like camera movement and character expressions, and how they would be able to set up the gags and transition from one scene to the next. When they had the storyboard set and they were happy with that, the director, and Chuck Jones in the case of many of these, would come in and draw the character layouts. The character layouts were actually good-looking sketches. They showed things like character movements, and this was also where the director got to put his influence and his vision for timing and framing and sequencing and stuff. This is how he communicated to the animators what he wanted the cartoon to end up as. Now, these cartoons were shot in 24 frames per second, and Looney Tunes was full-stop animation, so they needed 24 sketches per 1 second of animation. But the senior animators didn't do them all. The director would hand those character layouts down to them, and what they would do is they would draw what were called the extremes. No, I'm not a big like knowledgeable animation person. I had to do a little bit of research and digging on this, but the way it was explained to me is this. So consider like you're walking, right? And you're walking, and you've got a point in your walk where you're probably at your highest, and maybe not on the tiptoes, that's kind of a weird walk. But you're walking, and you've got kind of this peak position, and you've also got a low position as you're bending into it. Those might be the two extremes. So in a total of 24 frames, those might be the 2 frames that the senior animator would draw, maybe one extra one. Then they would hand this down to the people they called the in-betweeners. And it was the in-betweeners' job to take those extremes, fill in the gaps, and create a fluid, seamless animation. Now, what's really interesting about the process that Looney Tunes had, particularly with Chuck Jones, is the way that he approached character layouts. Most directors would only draw a few of these. It wasn't like something that, it wasn't something that you did a whole bunch of. Chuck would draw 2 to 3 times as many as a typical director would. And the reason why he did this is because, again, this is where he could influence and provide his vision for the cartoon to the animators. And he understood just how important it was for the animators and the in-betweeners to get every single frame just right. Chuck would say that you learn to respect that golden atom, that single frame, that 1/24th of a second, because it could be the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. He also would expand upon the rule of drawing. Every point on a line is of equal importance. That's rule number 1 of all great drawing. There's no rule number 2. You see, what Chuck recognized, what Chuck understood, was that it is those in-between moments that shape the perception of the cartoon. That's true of cartoons, that's true of film, that's true of any interactive medium, including the web. Now, over the last few years, we've really matured in the way that we talk about and approach the web. We've shifted from this idea of sort of a fixed canvas with predictable height and width to recognizing that these are variables that we have no control over, variables that are dictated by the screen, by the device, by the browser, by the user, but certainly not by us. And that's good, and you've seen responsive design kind of take off as a result of that, and we're finally starting to embrace the fluid nature of the web that John Alsop was talking about back in 2000 in the Tao of Web Design. But where it gets really interesting, I think, is when we start to recognize that the web also operates on a z-axis, time. We don't stand still on the web. We may interact with a website over the course of 5, 10, 20 seconds. And over the course of that time, we are constantly in movement. We're scrolling, we're submitting forms, we're clicking buttons, we're expanding accordions. We're moving from state to state and from page to page. We're constantly in transition. We're constantly having our experience sculpted by those in-between moments. Which is why it's so sad that historically we haven't done a very good job of paying attention to what we do there. We kind of treat those things as an afterthought. If you look at what we've done historically when we are transitioning from one place to the next, what have we done? We've slapped progress bars on everything. If you got a browser, and the page is slow to load, you slap a progress bar in there. If search results are slow coming back, you slap a progress bar in there. How many, do you guys know, I don't know if this was like a movie thing or maybe this is just an American thing, but maybe you had a grandpa like this or something, but that kind of guy who every time somebody would get hurt, he'd turn to you and he'd be like, you'll be fine, rub some dirt on it. You got a scratch on your arm, rub some dirt on it. You broke your back, rub some dirt on it. Got some dirt in your eye? Rub some dirt on it. That's basically been us with progress bars. We're using this everywhere. We're just slapping these things haphazardly in there. Historically, these intermediary states of our sites and applications have been kind of neglected. It's one that we sort of begrudgingly fix because it's there and it sticks out and we have to deal with it in some way. And I want to make it clear, I'm saying fix, because progress bars don't fix anything. Progress bars are the hold music of the internet. Whenever we use them, what we're basically saying is, here, guys, you know what? This might take a while. Why don't you guys just, kick off your shoes, lean back, relax. We're just going to put this same Kenny G song on repeat for the next 40 minutes. It's going to be fantastic. You guys are going to love it. Progress bars don't help anything. Progress bars, all they do, just like hold music, is they focus on the waiting. They draw attention to the fact that you're waiting for something you can't have yet. This is something Luke Verbluski found out with his app Polar, which was recently acquired by Google. Their go-to solution when they were getting stuff back from the server was to have these progress indicators, and they'd slap these throughout the application. And they got a lot of feedback about how slow their application was. So what Luke did is he switched to these things he called skeleton screens. So instead of a progress indicator, he'd slap up these, it's a little washed out, but there's gray boxes and lines and things like that he would slap in where the content was going to eventually be filled in. And as the server came back with that data, they would fill in all of those little areas. What this did is it sort of gave the users some clue about what was coming, what information was about to come back from the server and where it was going to go. It was sort of setting the stage a bit. And when they did this switch, the feedback about the app being slow went away. And as Luke pointed out, the reason for that is simple, because it was a shift from whereas progress bars were focusing on the waiting, the skeleton screens were focusing on the progress. They were focusing on what you were about to get. It's a subtle shift, but it moves from something negative to something positive. Instead of placing the focus on what you don't have, it's placing the focus on what you're about to get, what's coming down the pipe. And this isn't something, Luke wrote about this, it was great. It's not something that just Polar is using. Facebook does this whenever they bring in user stories on the wall. These are just, divs, empty divs, that are really washed out, but they're empty divs, they're pretend, that are like light gray, and they pulse a little bit like this until the story comes in and the pictures and the content gets placed on top. iOS applications have these launch screens. Now in practice, what we're actually doing is things like this. We're using them as like full-blown branding with our good friend the progress bar sitting in there. These big splash screens. And every time I see this, every time I open an app and I see this screen for a little while as things are loading, I can't help but feel like it seems awfully familiar to things that we were doing in the 1990s with the skip intro screens and the splash screens, right? But now we're purposely doing that everywhere because it was such a great idea the first time we did it. Apple doesn't want you to do this. What Apple in the guidelines talks about what these launch screens are for, they want you to do something more like this, like plain backgrounds or skeletons for the app or maybe like screenshots, whatever it is, something that sets the stage for what's going to come in on the app on top of it. Because they say the entire purpose of these is to enhance the experience, make it quick to launch and immediately ready to use, make it feel very fast. You see, Apple recognizes the importance of those transitions, of the in-between moments, and of making sure that they're carefully crafted. And you can see that throughout the operating system. Starting in iOS 7, they did this animation whenever you open a page in a new tab. What it does is it flips everything forward and flips it back. And so you can see the page being open and then stacking on top of the existing pages. This animation it's far from superfluous. It actually accomplishes several things. For one, it provides a little bit of eye candy, and that sometimes sounds like a dismissive term, but it's not. I think that there's actually a lot of value there. People want enjoyable and delightful experiences, and attention to details like this often gives that to them. When Adaptive Path was recently acquired by Capital One, a lot of people in the industry are like, whoa, this is really weird. This is a renowned, famous, awesome agency that's being acquired by a credit card company. Now, business logistics aside, the idea of a company like Capital One investing in design and bringing it in-house actually makes a lot of sense. We're seeing that happen quite a bit. Because people like beautiful things, and companies are finally just starting to figure that out, right? They're starting to recognize the importance of having good design by default, the importance of having a good user experience, and the importance of building something that's beautiful both visually and functionally. The second thing the animation does is it improves the perception of performance. When the animation occurs, as soon as you tap on open a new page, right there, it starts to load the page. It starts to make all the requests. It starts to try and render it inside of that new tab, all the while that animation is happening. And the result is that you get about a 200 to 300 millisecond head start on things. And while that doesn't sound like a very large number, it's not. It's still very impactful because it turns out that we are very sensitive to little delays in time in digital interfaces. This is a video from an experiment with Oculus Rift where they had this big gadget put on people's face, and what it did is it introduced latency and lag into everyday life. It introduced about a 300 millisecond delay into what they were seeing. And the results are delightfully embarrassing and funny, and it's thoroughly enjoyable to watch. I don't know if it was enjoyable for the young lady who was just ran over, but I mean, I enjoy the video. But that's a 300 millisecond delay. That's a minor delay, but the impact was dramatic. We're very sensitive to little delays. A 1968 study about digital interfaces and response times found that anything over 100 milliseconds stops feeling instantaneous. It becomes a noticeable delay. Noticeable to the point of altering the way that people are actually interacting with those interfaces. Walmart was improving the page load time on their site, and they found that for every 100 milliseconds that they shaved off, they saw a 1% increase in revenue. That lines up perfectly with what Amazon said a few years before, the exact same thing. For every 100 milliseconds, that was 1% of additional revenue. Yahoo found out that for every 400 milliseconds they shaved, they saw a 9% increase in traffic. These are fractions of a second, and yet they're having a huge impact on how people are interacting with that company and with those websites. So when you can get a 200 to 300 millisecond head start, that's kind of a big deal. The third thing that the animation does is it creates a connection. It connects the dots between one state and the next. When you do this, when it's doing this sort of opening and stacking thing, what it's doing is it's making it very clear to the user what's happening with that new tab. You've opened up a new page, and the old pages haven't gone away. They're sitting right behind it. It's telling the user a lot of information, providing a mental model for them to understand what's happening. Google has a really good example of this in their material design guidelines. They have this photo list application. And they demonstrated first what happens if you don't do any sort of transition. So if you tap on one of these, and it's just a hard cut, and the new thing comes in, and then it's a hard cut back out, that's kind of disorienting. You're not really sure where that came from. You're not, you have to take a half a second to remember how you got there. A nice subtle animation, like coming in from the side like this, helps create a relationship. You still know where you are. You can you don't feel lost inside of the interface. So it's a small animation, but it's accomplishing a lot. There's a lot that it's actually doing. And this is very deliberate and very intentional. And when we get deliberate about these things, we find out just how many opportunities there are to improve those in-between moments. So consider a travel booking site. This is Travelocity. And they have a lot to do, right? They have to get all the airline information and sort by price and sort by time and flight duration and all this other nonsense. And it's always a very slow thing. When I went, I was looking from Minneapolis to Berlin, and I think from when I hit the button to when all the results were on the page, it was about 3 seconds, I think, was the total duration, not quick. But they do something kind of smart. If you notice this side on the left where it says checking with airlines that fly route, watch that as they're loading the results. They're going to start to just gradually fill in the stuff on the right. And the left, that little message is going to start to change. Now it's telling me that it's getting flight information. It's going to tell me in a second, yep, searching for the shortest flights. It's telling me all of these steps that Travelocity is taking on my behalf. Now, I'm not foolish. They're not actually doing these things when they say that they're doing them, right? This is totally to appease me. This is for me. But it is actually a really effective little treatment. They did a study around this where they had a booking site that did this sort of behavior, and they had a booking site that did the more traditional progress bar and without the sort of messages exposing all of the steps. And what they found is that people preferred this overwhelmingly. even when this was like 3-4 seconds slower than the alternative. They also valued this more. They felt like this was doing all of the work for them, and they put more value on the results they were getting back, which makes sense because it's really hard to value what you can't see, right? That's why Apple has all these like storeroom, their stores are showroom style, and everything's set up in grand display for you to play with and touch. You see the 5K iMac come out, and they announce it, and you look at it and you're like, yeah, it's nice. It's a nice thing, but I don't know if I got $3,000 to spend on this thing. And then you go to an airport on the way to Berlin. I'm not being specific in examples here. And you see it set up, and you play with it, and you look at it, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, this is totally, yep, here, have my money. I was this close to bringing it to Berlin on a flight. I had no idea how I was going to pack it, but it looked that beautiful. But it's not just me, I don't think. I don't think I'm the only one gullible enough to go for that. But that's the reason why they do that, because it's easier to place value to something you can touch or something you can see. Author Dan Ariely tells a story about a locksmith that he knew. And when this locksmith was just starting out, he was very inexperienced. It took forever to pick a lock. He'd bloody his knuckles. It was a really painful thing. But the customers loved him. He got huge tips. Customers were always very happy. Things were going great. As the years went on, he got really good at this. He got really efficient. He started to be able to pick a lock very quickly, no more blood on the knuckles. And the tips went away, and people started complaining about how he was overcharging for everything. He was doing a better job for them. They weren't standing out for 30 minutes, they were standing out for 30 seconds. But because they could no longer see the effort and the knowledge and the work that goes into actually creating, unpicking a lock, they didn't value it anymore. They stopped putting a value on that, and they started thinking, well, this isn't really worth what I'm paying you. If you're doing a lot of work on the behalf of your users, it's okay to tell them that you're working for them. Don't be afraid to let them know. Provide feedback along the way to let them know the steps that you're taking during those in-between moments to get them to the end point. Feedback, like skeleton screens, focus on the progress. Feedback also eases anxiety. Don Norman, author of Design of Everyday Things, he once gave a talk about the work that he was doing with H&R Block at the time, and they were building this application that would do your taxes for you. And taxes, they're not fun. There's some things that are really complex, some calculations that are really tough. But because it's on a computer, they could do it instantly. But users hated that. They were like, wait a minute, I just did this last year. It took me an hour and a half to figure that out. You're telling me you can figure this out in 100 milliseconds? Nobody trusted it. They were all like, there's no way that the application is doing everything it's supposed to be doing right now. So their solution was they actually inserted artificial delays. They figured the calculation out instantly, but instead of displaying it, they basically did the Travelocity thing, and they're like, hey, we're running these calculations and things like that, hold on a second, and then they'd output it after a little bit of time. And people were happy with that. That made people more reassured that the application was actually working on their behalf. It's kind of counterintuitive, especially as somebody like me. I go around talking to everybody about how we got to make things faster, but every once in a while, it's nice to slow things down. There's a little bit of value in slow. Don't tweet that. I'm serious. I work as a performance nut. If it gets out that I'm telling people to slow things down, I'm going to be out of a job. I'm going to have to switch careers, and I frankly don't know if they're hiring cartoon critics anywhere. It's going to be rough. No, it's important to slow down sometimes. Slow has value in terms of reassuring people. It also has value for demonstrating things. If it's a new interface, sometimes a slow transition, exaggerating those in-between moments can help it make apparent what's happening and help people learn and grow more comfortable in an interface. And I think that the common line between what we're seeing here, too, in these experiences where they had to slow things down, is that it's addressing anxiety. If you're booking a flight and you want the best value, it can be kind of a stressful thing. You have to figure out all the timing. Like, imagine doing all the stuff that Travelocity or these other booking sites are doing, but doing it all yourself. That's a lot of data you're parsing manually, and you're nervous, and you want to get the right flight and get in at the right time. Getting locked out of your house or your car, that's not fun. Doing taxes, who here likes doing taxes? I heard one person, yeah. No, my dad was an accountant, and he didn't like doing taxes. Tax season, he'd get all grumpy and stressed out. These things are things that we worry about. They're things that we have anxiety about. And by telling people, acknowledging those anxieties and responding to them and giving them some feedback along those lines, it shows people that we care. In fact, that's kind of an underlying theme for a lot of these things. It's caring enough about the user to give them a quality experience. It's caring enough to pay attention to the little details that shape experiences. because we can't just haphazardly throw these things out there. We can't haphazardly deal with the transitions and animations or race to the finish line. It's more of a choreographical sort of thing. Google has these, they've been promoting very heavily inside of their guidelines that transitions need to be meaningful. They're not just there to be pretty, but they have to have a functional purpose that goes along with them. Microsoft also has a whole series of guidelines around transitions and animations and moving from state to state. Things like avoiding superfluous animation that's going to annoy instead of delight. If you're transitioning and it's while the user's trying to complete a task, get out of their way as quickly as possible. In fact, they go as far as to suggest that you should be 200 milliseconds or less. They have a specific guideline that they use. It sounds a little low. It might actually be kind of high, as it turns out. I was talking to Rachel Neighbors, who is an award-winning cartoonist turned awesome web developer, and I was asking her a ton of questions about animation throughout this entire thing. And one of the things she said about timing was that the rule of thumb is however long you think you need, cut it in half, and then cut it in half again. And this lines up really well with anecdotal evidence from Kenneth Bowles, a design manager at Twitter, who said, sometimes when they release an update at Twitter, he'll tighten up a transition by 50 milliseconds, and everybody's like, oh, it's so much faster now. Kenneth's confession actually hints at another important principle when it comes to how we craft those in-between moments and those transitions, and that is gradual reduction. Consider the H&R Block thing, right? You were doing that to kind of build trust for the users, to make them feel comfortable. But after they've used that application, say I'm a tax professional and I've prepared 5, 6 things, that delay doesn't have to be there anymore. I've got this built-in trust in the system. You can gradually reduce that transition time until it's back to feeling instantaneous. The same thing with any sort of animation or transition that's used to help you learn an interface. As you become more experienced with that interface, it's not as necessary anymore, and you can kind of reduce that and not make it quite as long. And it's not just the timing, of course, that matters, but it's how we do these transitions. If you look at CSS or JavaScript animation demos, you typically see the default is this ease in, ease out. So if you've got 2 images fading, they both fade for about the same time. The new image, takes about as long to come in as the old image does to take out. Somebody did an experiment around this. They compared this with 2 images with the typical ease in out. They compared that to a 75-25 split, so having that old image take a while to go out, and then the new image comes in very quickly at the end. And they compared that to a 25-75, where the old image was removed very quickly, and the new image took a long time to come in. This is what people preferred, overwhelmingly, even when this animation, this transition, took 2 to 3 seconds longer than the other ones. What mattered most was that they saw that old image get the heck out of the way. What mattered most was the progress. You see this in real-world stuff as well. This is why a lot of amusement parks or airplane, pilot, or what's that called? Airports, thank you. But that's why the airports are like amusement, they'll have these lines that wrap, that snake around. There's a couple reasons for this, and one of them is that this doesn't feel quite as long. If you're standing back at the back of a straight line, you're looking down and you're like, holy crap, that's a long way away. You feel closer when you've got a snake line. Disney talks about this in their whole crowd control sort of thing. You feel closer, and you also feel like you're making more progress because, frankly, you have to work a lot harder because you have to go back and forth and back and forth. But you're doing so many more steps, it feels like you're making a lot of progress, so you feel a lot happier. This idea of breaking out steps, it comes into play in the way Instagram does their photo uploads. So if you upload a photo to Instagram, you have to crop the photo, you have to choose a filter and apply the filter and tweak that, and then you have to eventually add your description and your tags and your location. Breaking it out by this, like having each of these steps on their own, each of these steps feel very manageable. They feel very quick. They're little micro steps that you can complete quickly, and as a user, you feel like you're making progress. It also gives Instagram the benefit that they can actually start uploading the photo after that image is initially cropped. And then while you're doing the tags and the description, the application is already working in the background to get that up to the server, so it feels quicker when you're done. It feels almost instantaneous when it gets added to your feed. So it's a way, in their case, of actually eliminating that wait. In decisions like this, like breaking things out or finding ways to reduce those in-between moments where they're not needed, they show an important focus on the user and focus on that experience. And I like this shift. I feel like over the last few years we've gotten a little bit more open as a community talking about things like performance. For a while it felt like that was the kind of thing you could only talk about in the dark closeted rooms, in the basement and stuff like that. It just wasn't a topic people were discussing everywhere. And we talk about it a lot now, which is awesome because it's a fundamental consideration for a user experience. It can make or break it in many cases. But we focus on the numbers an awful lot when we talk about performance. We talk a lot about specific metrics, the weight of the page or the speed index or loading in X seconds. I do this all the time. I talk about performance budgets and using all these metrics to guide what you're doing. They're important and they matter and they have their place, but what's more important is that we don't lose focus on what this is actually supposed to be doing, why we're doing performance optimization or any of this in any way. It's to reduce friction from the user experience. It's to help the users complete their tasks that they came to the site or application to do, complete those tasks as painlessly as possible. And how fast they do that matters, but it's more important is the quality of the trip. The UIE, the Jared School, their organization did some research on this a long time ago. They had a bunch of people in a room and they said, here, you have to complete these tasks across a few e-commerce sites. And some of the sites that they used, the information architecture was really solid. Everything kind of flowed and made sense, and they were easily able to complete their tasks. They were pretty happy. And other ones, it was a nightmare. It was like somebody's drunk cousin had organized the navigation, and so it took them forever to get through and complete their tasks, and in some cases they couldn't. When this was all said and done, they pulled everybody who was in the study together, and they said, okay, grade these sites in terms of how fast they were. Tell us, rank them based on how fast they were. And what they found is that the sites where they completed their tasks without frustration and without U-turns, those were the sites that were like, oh yeah, that was way faster than the other sites. The funny thing is, at least in one of those cases, one of those sites was like 2 to 3 times as slow as any other site tested. It was the slowest by far. But because they were able to complete their task without frustration, without all that friction, they're like, yeah, that felt a lot faster to us. That was a faster site. And I like this shift from the metrics to the experience. It often gets compared to illusions and sort of magic, and in kind of a way it is. I mean, you're kind of creating the illusion of performance, when you're doing perceived performance. But I prefer the choreography analogy. Because as we've seen, it's not just about as fast as you can go or reducing those in-between moments. It's knowing when to go fast and when to slow down, when to exaggerate things, and when to reel them in, and what animations to use, what transitions to do. It's far more choreography than it is magic. And this is going to become increasingly important over the next few years. Because right now, there is a gap in the user experience of a browser. There is a big gap. In fact, I'm going to call it a bug in the browser. When you open a new page in a web browser, what does the web browser do? It has to go out, request all the new assets, then it has to clear the page that's on at the moment, and then completely re-render everything with all the new content. Now, it looks different in different browsers. It looks different depending on how quickly your site loads, but there is always that little hiccup in the experience. There's always that little gap. I equate this to the equivalent of basically dropping frames from animation, right? That's what browsers are doing. No matter how carefully you're constructing those experiences, they're introducing unnecessary friction along the way. And this is why you see a lot of single-page apps. This is why you see a lot of things like jQuery and the like that have built-in page transitions right into the library, and why people are trying to do those things to try and circumvent some of this, the browser UX issues around this. And thankfully, this is an issue that browsers also recognize is a problem and something they actually want to address and fix. Mozilla is doing a lot of experimentation around how to improve perceived performance inside of Firefox. Microsoft, I don't know, several years ago came up with an idea for transitioning from pages to pages. It was a pretty proprietary, weird thing, which is why it never took off. Blink is actively doing this right now. They're actively exploring a navigation transition specification, which would be very awesome. It would let you define certain elements that would be persistent from page to page. So like a header that is going to be the same on one page to the next, you could say, okay, browser, don't worry about re-rendering this. Keep this persistent throughout. And it also lets you define transitions and animations to the elements that exist on the page. So if you've got a button and it's going to move to a different part on the next screen, you could actually tell it, okay, move that using a Bezier curve over like 0.3 seconds or something like that. Somebody did a concept recording of what this would look like. What does web moving from page to page look like in an environment where we don't have to do that full refresh and where we've got things like navigation transitions in place? And it's a much more fluid, dare I say app-like, choreographed experience. So this is going to happen. Browsers understand this is an issue. They're working on this. Kenneth Bowles, I mentioned Kenneth earlier. He's been really pushing people to learn motion design. He's a big advocate for that, and I tend to agree. There's a lot of value in really sculpting those transitions and those behaviors and those in-between moments. And with the combination of technology like service workers and navigation transitions and things like that, we're actually finally going to have the power to be able to do this. And the designers and the developers who can appropriately wield that power are going to be in very high demand. And there's going to be a lot of experimentation and a lot of play and a lot of learning that we're going to have to do along the lines here. You know, we're not going to be able to find this from our typical web kind of conversations. We're going to have to go out of bounds a little bit and look at games. We're going to have to talk to people who were doing Flash development. Yeah, I said it, Flash. I found out the other night over beers with Mark that actually quite a few people in the audience, including some in the front row who could throw things at me, were Flash developers in the past. And frankly, you guys have been through so much, so many hardships, I thought I needed to throw you a bone in the presentation. No, but seriously, like there's a lot of examples of horrible Flash, right? There are plenty. You don't have to look very far. But there's also some really nice things that happened, some really nice motion design that was taking place. And of course, we can learn from things like cartoons. So go home and watch a whole bunch of Looney Tunes, just like I did. You see, the Looney Tunes knew. They knew when to slow down, when to go fast. They knew that Wile E. Coyote falling off a cliff was only funny if he had to pause a second to realize that, oh crap, there's nothing underneath me. I'm going to plummet to my death. That's what made it funny. It was that delay. They understood that as much could be said from the posture of a character as from the words that actually came out of his mouth. They understood it was those little details that would turn an average cartoon into one that was going to delight people for the next 50, 60 years. And that's an admirable goal for us to go after, too, to be able to create delightful, impactful experiences. And it's not that hard to do. We can do this. We just have to shift a little bit from the current state. We can focus on the progress. We can stop haphazardly using progress bars everywhere and drawing attention to the waiting instead. We can address anxiety. We can make sure that we understand what our users are worried about, what they're anxious about, and let them know that we're paying attention to that by providing feedback throughout. And we can be deliberate with our transitions and our animations. We can use them to provide something that's both beautiful and functional, not just haphazardly throwing in there. You know, through careful choreography, we can make sure that these in-between moments feel intentional, that they don't break the user's state of flow, but they help to maintain it and help to guide them through the application. When we get there matters, but not as much as how we get there. And if we do this, the result is going to be something that feels fluid, something that feels cohesive, something that feels fast from start to finish and everywhere in between. Thank you.
Let's see.